Lieutenant Saburo Sakai had seen nearly everything a fighter pilot could see. By 1944, he was one of Japan's most celebrated aces, a veteran of China, Rabaul, and Guadalcanal, with over 60 confirmed victories. He had fought through fire and fear, through skies thick with tracer rounds and the endless roar of engines. But even Sakai, hardened by years of combat, would later admit that something had changed. The air war over the Pacific was no longer the same. The Zero, once untouchable, was being outflown and outgunned. Japanese airfields that had once launched proud squadrons now stood half-empty, filled with wrecks and stripped fuselages. Mechanics scavenged parts from one aircraft to make another barely airworthy. And somewhere far across the Pacific, new American aircraft, faster, stronger, and seemingly endless, were arriving in numbers Japan could never hope to match. Sakai recalled the first time he faced a P-38 Lightning. The twin-boom silhouette looked alien against the sky, its speed unreal. His Zero twisted, rolled, and climbed. Maneuvers that had once guaranteed survival. But the P-38 stayed with him, its two engines screaming in perfect harmony, guns flashing from the nose. Only a desperate dive into cloud cover saved him that day. The message was unmistakable. The age of the Zero was ending. By 1944, the Pacific War had become a war of range. Distances between targets were vast, measured not in miles but in oceans. For the Americans, conquering the sky over Japan meant solving a nearly impossible problem: how to send fighters far enough to protect their bombers, and still have them return alive. The answer would come from a combination of engineering brilliance, industrial might, and the quiet genius of a few men who understood both machines and limits better than anyone else. Among them was a man whose name had already become legend long before the war: Charles Lindbergh. While the world remembered him as the lone aviator who crossed the Atlantic in 1927, Lindbergh had spent the years before and during the war studying engines, aerodynamics, and efficiency. He knew that victory in the air wasn't only about speed or firepower, it was about endurance. And it was endurance that would soon decide the fate of the Pacific. By early 1945, the U.S. had seized Iwo Jima, a small, sulphurous island halfway between the Marianas and Japan. The cost was staggering: over 26,000 American casualties, nearly the entire Japanese garrison wiped out. But Iwo Jima was more than a dot on a map. It was the key to Japan's front door. From that volcanic rock, American fighters could finally reach the Japanese home islands. Engineers worked around the clock, carving runways into the black ash, building fuel depots, radar stations, and maintenance bays under constant enemy shelling. Soon, 3 airfields stretched across the island: South, Central, and North Field, ready to launch a new era of air warfare. The P-38 Lightning had already earned a fearsome reputation. Its twin engines gave it range and reliability unmatched by any other fighter in the theater. Pilots loved its stability, its heavy armament, and its ability to bring them home even when one engine was shot out. It had become the workhorse of the Pacific, escorting bombers, strafing ships, and intercepting enemy aircraft from New Guinea to the Philippines. But now, a new machine was arriving, one that would define the final act of the war: the P-51 Mustang. Sleek, powerful, and fast, the Mustang was built not just to fight, but to endure. With its Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, it could fly more than 1,600 miles on drop tanks, an unheard-of range for a single-engine fighter. Its introduction to the Pacific meant something extraordinary was about to happen. The men of the 15th, 21st, and 506th Fighter Groups began preparing for what they called VLR, Very Long-Range Missions. These were not simple sorties. They were 8-hour journeys across endless ocean into the most heavily defended airspace on Earth. The risks were immense. If a pilot's compass failed, if a tank ran dry, if an engine faltered, there would be no rescue. Only the Pacific's silent expanse waiting below. Each pilot carried a small emergency kit, a life raft, a radio, a pistol. But most knew that if they went down halfway to Japan, no one would find them. Still, they volunteered. They were young, confident, and in many cases, barely older than 20. The war had turned them into experts in survival. Training was relentless. Pilots drilled in formation flying, practiced rendezvousing with bombers hundreds of miles from land, and learned to calculate fuel burn by instinct. They were told to think like engineers, to trim their aircraft perfectly, to lean their fuel mixture just enough to save a few gallons, to nurse their engines through every climb and turn. Over the Pacific, precision meant life. The Japanese, meanwhile, watched in growing alarm. Their intelligence officers noted the increasing number of American aircraft appearing farther and farther north, places once believed unreachable. Intercepts over Formosa and Okinawa began to show something new. P-38s and P-51s flying together in formations that stretched to the horizon. On April 7, 1945, the first VLR mission to Tokyo was launched from Iwo Jima. 148 Mustangs roared into the morning sky, silver flashes catching the light as they climbed through thin tropical clouds. Ahead lay nearly 2,500 miles of ocean and the heart of Japan's empire. For the Japanese defenders, the sight was terrifying. Radar operators in Tokyo scrambled to make sense of the signals appearing from the southeast. Fighters were scrambled. Kai-84, Franks, Kai-43, Oscars, and a handful of worn-out Zeros. But the Mustangs arrived fast, high, and coordinated. Their task was simple: protect the B-29 bombers striking Tokyo and destroy anything that rose to meet them. The sky erupted. Dogfights stretched from sea level to 30,000 feet. Tracer fire arced through the air. Engines screamed, and vapor trails twisted like smoke over the city. American pilots called it the longest day in the sky. Lieutenant Colonel James Tapp led the first group that morning. He later recalled how fuel gauges fell faster than he wanted them to, how every maneuver felt like gambling with the return trip. Yet he and his men held the line, breaking enemy formations and shielding the bombers as they unleashed destruction over Tokyo. By dusk, the mission was over. 21 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed, and every B-29 escorted that day made it home. The impossible had been done. For the first time, single-engine fighters had escorted bombers to Tokyo and back. The psychological impact was enormous. For the Japanese command, it was a moment of disbelief. For their pilots, it was the realization that nowhere, not even the skies above their capital, was safe. Over the next several weeks, the long-range raids intensified. The Mustangs struck airfields, rail lines, and industrial zones from Nagoya to Yokohama. They hunted enemy aircraft on the ground, strafed convoys, and provided cover for nearly every major bombing run from Iwo Jima. The Japanese Air Force, once dominant across Asia, was now fighting for its life. But the Americans paid their price as well. Pilots who missed formation or lost bearings sometimes vanished without a trace. Many were seen ditching in the ocean, sending faint SOS signals that faded into static. Rescue submarines, part of a secret operation called Dumbo, were stationed along the route, but they could only save a few. For every victory over Tokyo, there were men who never returned. Still, morale among the Mustang squadrons remained high. They were proving the unthinkable. That technology, discipline, and courage could overcome even the tyranny of distance. Pilots began to develop their own fuel-saving techniques, some inspired by Charles Lindbergh's earlier demonstrations in the Pacific. He had shown them that throttling back, reducing RPM, and adjusting the fuel mixture could stretch range dramatically without sacrificing speed in combat. By May 1945, those lessons were saving lives. Every pilot became his own mechanic, his own engineer, constantly balancing performance and endurance. Missions once thought suicidal were now routine. The Japanese pilots, exhausted and short of fuel, could only watch as American aircraft came and went with mechanical precision. Their own machines, running on inferior fuel, coughed and sputtered. Many Zeros failed to reach altitude before battle even began. For the veterans like Saburo Sakai, it was heartbreaking to witness. They had once believed their skill could overcome any disadvantage. Now, even that belief was slipping away. By summer, the transformation was complete. The P-38s and P-51s of the 7th Fighter Command ruled the air. B-29 bombers could strike anywhere in Japan with full escort, day or night. Every mission cut deeper into Japan's defenses, burning away what little hope remained. For the Americans, it was not just victory through firepower, it was victory through mastery. They had turned knowledge into endurance, endurance into reach, and reach into dominance. And for the few Japanese pilots still flying, men like Saburo Sakai, the realization was inescapable. The sky, once their kingdom, now belonged to someone else. Each roar of a Packard Merlin engine meant another mission into the unknown. Another line of silver fighters stretching across 1,500 miles of open ocean toward Japan. The pilots called it the long reach. The Japanese would soon know it as something far worse. The sound of inevitability. The first missions from Iwo Jima had proven the impossible could be done. But now came the real test, sustaining it. Could single-engine fighters really fly round trips of 8 hours over water, fight over enemy territory, and return safely, day after day? Every takeoff carried that question, and with every landing, the Mustangs wrote the answer in smoke and victory. By May 1945, the tempo of operations from Iwo Jima had become relentless. The 15th, 21st, and 506th Fighter Groups rotated through missions almost daily. Each dawn began, with pre-flight checks under the harsh island sun, mechanics tuning engines, loading 50-caliber belts, and inspecting the delicate network of drop tanks that made these missions possible. Those drop tanks were more than fuel reserves. They were lifelines. They extended the Mustang's reach to the heart of Japan. Pilots would burn their external fuel first, then jettison the tanks before combat, switching to internal reserves just before reaching the enemy coast. A single mistake in timing could mean running out of fuel hundreds of miles from home. The Japanese command, meanwhile, struggled to understand how the Americans were doing it. Radar reports showed incoming formations farther and farther inland. Mustangs sweeping across Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, places once believed untouchable. The Japanese pilots scrambled from airfields like Atsugi and Chofu, climbing desperately to intercept. But their aircraft, the Ki-84, Frank, Ki-61, Tony, and the once-feared Zero, could barely match the Mustang's speed or climb rate. The air battles over Japan were unlike anything before. The Americans flew with calculated precision, executing complex escort formations refined over Europe. The Mustangs flew high, protecting B-29 bombers, while lower elements broke off to hunt Japanese fighters and strafe airfields. Japanese defenders tried every tactic they knew: head-on attacks, ambushes from above, desperate ramming attempts. But the balance had shifted irreversibly. By June, the statistics told the truth. The 7th Fighter Command's P-51s had flown dozens of long-range missions. Hundreds of B-29s had reached their targets and returned. Japanese resistance was still fierce, but it was disorganized, reactive, and often suicidal. To the men in the cockpits, every mission was a lesson in endurance. The flight to Japan took nearly 3 hours, mostly over featureless ocean. Pilots stared at compass headings, listening to engines hum with hypnotic rhythm. Fatigue set in long before reaching the coast. Then came the tension. The moment radar picked up enemy contacts. Within seconds, the monotony of flight gave way to chaos. Major James Tapp, leading one of the early missions, described the transition perfectly. It went from silence to hell in 30 seconds. The Japanese would attack in small groups, often outnumbered but never lacking courage. They would dive, out of the sun, guns blazing, trying to close the distance before the Mustang's superior firepower tore them apart. Sometimes they succeeded, but rarely did they survive. By this point in the war, Japan's air defense network was collapsing. Fuel shortages crippled training. Many new pilots arrived in combat units with less than 100 total flight hours. Some had never fired their weapons in training due to ammunition scarcity. Against the battle-hardened Americans, men with hundreds of hours of experience, trained in formation tactics and gunnery precision, the results were tragic. The heat, Americans began calling these encounters milk runs, though no one truly believed they were easy. Mechanical failures, weather, and sheer exhaustion killed nearly as many pilots as the enemy did. But compared to what Japan was enduring, the difference was stark. Japan's once vaunted industrial power had turned into rubble. B-29s, now escorted, every step of the way, flattened entire cities in single nights. Factories that built aircraft were reduced to smoldering metal. Refineries stopped producing fuel. Even air bases once used by Japan's elite squadrons became nothing more than blackened craters under the Mustang's guns. Yet amid the destruction, Japanese pilots continued to fly. Many fought with unmatched bravery, launching in outdated aircraft, sometimes knowing they would not return. Some resorted to kamikaze tactics against bombers and fighters alike, acts of desperation that symbolized both their courage and their hopelessness. Saburo Sakai, grounded by injury but still respected among his peers, later reflected that this was the most painful time of all. Watching younger men die in obsolete machines, knowing that their sacrifice changed nothing. It broke his heart more than any wound ever had. He wrote in his memoir years later, "We fought with courage, but without hope. Every flight was a prayer, every return a miracle. When the Mustangs came, we knew it was over." Those Mustangs had become more than just aircraft. They were symbols, the embodiment of America's ability to project power across oceans. Each fighter represented not just the pilot inside, but the factories, engineers, and workers behind it. From Detroit assembly lines to California airfields, America's industrial machine had reached its peak. By mid-1945, the results were undeniable. Between April and August, the 7th Fighter Command's P-51s were credited with destroying over 200 Japanese aircraft in aerial combat. 75% of all U.S. fighter victories in the Pacific during that period came from Mustangs. The 15th Fighter Group alone scored 111 confirmed kills. The 21st followed with 71. The newly arrived 506th contributed 24 despite joining late and suffering heavy early losses on Black Friday. 5 American pilots became aces while flying. From Iwo Jima, including Major James Tapp, the first to down 5 enemy aircraft during the long-range campaign. American losses, by contrast, totaled around 180 P-51s over 4 months, but fewer than 30 were due to enemy fighters. The rest were operational losses, accidents, fuel miscalculations, mechanical issues. Statistically, the Americans enjoyed a 7-to-1 kill ratio, an almost unimaginable advantage in air combat. For Japan, the numbers were devastating. Their fighter strength dwindled daily. Aircraft that did survive often couldn't take off for lack of fuel or spare parts. By July, many airfields around Tokyo were little more than graveyards of abandoned planes. And yet, the symbolism of those final months went beyond the statistics. The Mustang's appearance over Tokyo carried psychological weight that no bomb could match. Japanese civilians, who had been told for years that the homeland was impregnable, now watched American fighters circle their skies unopposed. The illusion of invincibility, the myth of the Fortress Japan, shattered before their eyes. To the military, the Mustang represented a fatal truth. It wasn't just that America had better planes. It was that America could build better planes, faster, in endless numbers. The P-51 was the tip of an industrial spear forged by hundreds of thousands of workers back home. In 1944 alone, American factories produced 96,000 aircraft, more than triple Japan's output of 28,000, many of which were obsolete or so poorly manufactured they barely flew. By 1945, Japan's industrial base had been bombed into ruin. Factories relocated into caves or tunnels, quality control disappeared, and engines rolled off assembly lines with defective pistons and warped airframes. It was a collapse not just of production, but of confidence. American pilots, meanwhile, received the finest training program ever devised. From primary trainers to combat readiness, each stage was structured, standardized, and efficient. They learned to fly by instruments, to master gunnery, to navigate long distances with precision. By the time they reached Iwo Jima, they were professionals in every sense. Their Japanese counterparts, once among the best in the world, were now being rushed into combat with barely any flight experience. Fuel shortages meant they could not train properly. Many had never flown in formation. When they met the Mustangs, they were not just outnumbered, they were outclassed. By the summer of 1945, the Mustang had done what no aircraft in history had accomplished. It made the skies over Japan an American domain. From that dominance flowed everything that followed: the firebombing of Tokyo, the destruction of Japan's war industries, and ultimately the atomic bombings that ended the war. Without air superiority, none of it would have been possible. When the war finally ended, many of the Mustang pilots who flew from Iwo Jima looked back in disbelief. They had flown missions that defied every rule of combat aviation. single-engine fighters over 1,500 miles of ocean, 8-hour sorties, through storms and anti-aircraft fire, facing enemies who refused to surrender. They had seen the Pacific from one end to the other. They had watched Japan's empire burn beneath their wings. And through it all, their aircraft, that sleek, relentless machine, had carried them home. The P-51 Mustang wasn't just a weapon. It was a message written in aluminum, steel, and courage. That innovation, discipline, and industry could overcome even the most formidable enemy. For Japan, it was the beginning of the end. For the world, it was the dawn of modern air power. And for the men who lived it, it was proof that sometimes history is decided not by nations or generals, but by a few hundred young men in silver fighters, carving the future with their contrails across an endless sky. The long-range Mustangs from Iwo Jima had achieved what even the boldest planners once thought impossible. They had stretched America's reach across the entire Pacific. They had escorted the B-29s to the heart of Japan, shattered its defenses, and made even the skies above Tokyo American territory. By June, Japanese Air Command reports were grim. Fuel stocks were nearly exhausted. Airfields had been cratered beyond repair. The few remaining aircraft were being dispersed into forest clearings, hidden under camouflage nets, waiting for an order that would never come. The Japanese had entered what one officer called the last breath of the homeland's defense. But still, they tried to fight. Pilots were trained in hastily assembled classrooms. Teenagers barely out of school memorized emergency procedures on chalkboards, while the distant rumble of bombs shook the walls. They learned to take off, but not always to land. They were given a mission, not a future. Meanwhile, the P-51 Mustang pilots of the 7th Fighter Command flew deeper into Japan than ever before. Each new mission extended farther, not just to escort bombers, but to strike targets of opportunity on their own. Airfields, train depots, fuel convoys, even naval bases. Major John C. Meyer of the 352nd once described the feeling, "You'd look down and realize there's nowhere left to hide." We weren't fighting for airspace anymore. We owned it. The Mustangs attacked in coordinated waves. The first flights swept in low, strafing runways to keep defenders grounded. The second wave came higher, covering the bombers as they unloaded incendiaries that turned cities into infernos. Then came the third, hunting anything that moved. Trains, trucks, ships, even radio towers. For the Japanese, it became a nightmare without end. Tokyo's once mighty fighter groups, the 244th Sentai, the elite of the home defense, found themselves grounded. Their Kai-84 Franks and Kai-61 Tonys sat idle on airfields that were little more than ash and cratered concrete. The 244th's commander, Colonel Teruhiko Kobayashi, tried everything, moving aircraft to rural airstrips, dispersing fuel drums, training his pilots for kamikaze attacks. But nothing could stop the tide. Every attempt to intercept the B-29s ended the same way. A few Japanese fighters rising to meet hundreds of American planes. Mustangs and Superfortresses moving in perfect coordination. By mid-July, even Japan's radar operators stopped sounding alarms. There was no point. They would watch the blips appear on the screens, moving steadily toward Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, and they knew the pattern by heart. Within hours, another city would burn. The Japanese High Command faced an unthinkable dilemma. Their once proud Air Force, the same that had stunned the world at Pearl Harbor, was now reduced to fragments. Their best instructors were dead. Their replacements were boys, some as young as 16, flying outdated planes held together with scrap metal. And their enemy, calm, methodical, unstoppable, had just begun. The statistics were staggering. In just over 4 months, the P-51s from Iwo Jima had flown more than 1,000 long-range escort missions. They had destroyed over 400 Japanese aircraft in the air and hundreds more on the ground. Their losses were minimal, fewer than 200 Mustangs, most to mechanical issues or weather. The kill ratio was an astonishing 7-to-1 in favor of the Americans, but behind every number was a story, and behind every flight, a man. One of them was Lieutenant Robert W. McLean, who flew escort on July 16, 1945. His group was covering B-29s headed for Osaka when Japanese fighters suddenly appeared. A swarm of Ki-84s dove in from above, and the sky turned into chaos. McLean spotted 2 on his tail, pulled into a tight climb, and flipped his Mustang into a split S. In a single pass, he shot one down and sent the other spinning into a hillside. When he landed back at Iwo, his fuel gauge read 0. That was a common story. Pilots returning on fumes, engines coughing, faces gray with exhaustion. The missions averaged 7 to 8 hours, with no autopilot, no ejection seats, and no navigation aids other than the compass and the stars. And yet, they kept going. Why? Because every mission brought Japan closer to surrender, and every victory meant one less Japanese city capable of producing death. By July, Japan's air resistance was collapsing completely. The once feared Zero fighter had become obsolete, its lightweight frame no match for the high-speed Mustangs. Japanese radar stations were gone, communication lines severed, and even command coordination was breaking down. American pilots began encountering lone Japanese planes flying aimlessly, sometimes without weapons, sometimes with just enough fuel for a final climb and dive. Some refused to bail out, even when their aircraft were on fire. These were not missions of strategy anymore. They were gestures of despair. Major James Tapp, now a decorated ace, recalled the strange feeling of those final weeks. "It wasn't joy anymore," he said. "You could see it, the end of something. You didn't cheer for a kill. You just flew home and hoped it was the last one." The Japanese soldiers on the ground felt it too. Many had grown up believing the Emperor's divine protection made Japan invincible. But now, every day brought the roar of enemy engines overhead, the rumble of bombs, and the collapse of another city. The psychological impact was devastating. Japanese morale, once fanatically strong, began to break. Civilians dug shelters by the millions, but even underground they could feel the tremors of destruction. Every night, the sky glowed orange from fires that burned miles away. Every morning, the news brought new words. Tokyo destroyed. Yokohama gone. Nagoya crippled. For the first time in modern history, Japan was learning what it felt like to be invaded, not by troops, but by air. And it was the Mustang that made it possible. Without the P-51, the B-29s would have been too vulnerable to reach Japan in daylight. Without its range, the U.S. could never have gained the air superiority needed for an invasion. The Mustang was the bridge between the Pacific Islands and the Japanese homeland. A bridge built on courage, engineering, and sheer willpower. By August 1945, Japan's cities were smoking ruins. Its navy was gone, its army trapped, and its air force, the pride of its early victories, was annihilated. But even then, the Mustangs kept flying. They escorted reconnaissance missions, attacked railways, and patrolled the skies for any last sign of resistance. They were there when the B-29s carried out the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they were still in the air on August 15th, when Emperor Hirohito's voice broke through Japanese radios for the first time, announcing surrender. For the men of the Mustang squadrons, the war ended not with a battle, but with a silence. When they landed that final day, there were no cheers, no trumpets, just relief and disbelief. They had flown the longest, hardest missions of the war and survived. They had seen the face of the enemy up close and understood his bravery as much as his defeat. Years later, historians would call the Mustang the most important fighter of World War II, not because it was perfect, but because it changed what was possible. It turned the Pacific Ocean, once an unbridgeable barrier, into a highway for American power. It broke the back of Japan's air defense, and it proved that technology, when matched with discipline and courage, could reshape the world. Even Japanese veterans, looking back decades later, spoke with a kind of reverent respect. Saburo Sakai, the famed ace who had fought since the war's first day, said simply, "When the Mustangs came, the war was over. They ruled the air, and we knew it. For those who flew them, the P-51 was more than a machine. It was a symbol of endurance, of innovation, and of the will to see the fight through to the end." The war had begun with Japanese fighters soaring over Pearl Harbor, confident and unchallenged. It ended with American Mustangs circling Tokyo, unopposed and unafraid. History had come full circle. The hunter had become the hunted, and in the silence that followed, a new world began to take shape. One born from fire, courage, and the sound of a single engine echoing over a defeated empire. It was the sound that marked the end of an empire. High above Tokyo, a faint metallic roar echoed through the clouds, the unmistakable hum of a Merlin engine slicing through thin summer air. Below, the city smoldered. Above, American pilots watched the horizon and realized that there were no more enemies left to fight. The war in the Pacific was ending, and the P-51 Mustang had written its final, undeniable chapter. By August 1945, Japan's skies no longer belonged to Japan. The few surviving pilots of the Imperial Army Air Force knew it, and so did every civilian who looked up and saw silver wings tracing vapor lines over their homeland. The 15th and 506th fighter groups had fought one of their last major engagements near Tokyo, destroying 7 Japanese aircraft. 5 days later, Japan surrendered. The war, the most devastating in human history, was finally over. Between April 7th and August 15th, 1945, the Mustang had become the instrument of air supremacy. In those 4 months, they flew 51 major missions over Japan's home islands. They escorted hundreds of B-29 Superfortress bombers, conducted relentless ground strikes, and dismantled the last remnants of Japanese air power piece by piece. When the final tallies were written, the story was clear. Across 7 U.S. fighter commands, Mustangs were credited with 206 aerial victories over Japan, roughly 75% of all American fighter kills in that theater during those final months. The 15th Fighter Group topped the list with 111 confirmed kills. The 21st followed with 71, and the 506th, despite joining late and suffering catastrophic losses during Black Friday, achieved 24 confirmed victories. 5 American pilots from Iwo Jima became aces during that short but brutal campaign. Among them was Major James Tapp, who achieved his 5th kill on April 19th, becoming the first ace of the long-range Mustang missions. In total, around 180 P-51s were lost in the 4-month campaign. Of those, fewer than 30 were destroyed in air combat. The rest fell victim to the elements. Engine failures, navigation errors, fuel shortages, and the merciless storms that swept the Pacific. Even with those losses, the air combat exchange ratio was staggering, more than 7-to-1 in favor of the United States. The Japanese were simply overwhelmed. Their remaining aircraft were outclassed, their fuel reserves exhausted, and their training programs shattered beyond repair. For Japan's surviving pilots, those final encounters were as haunting as they were hopeless. Many of them would later write about their shock at facing the Mustangs, machines that seemed untouchable, moving with speed and precision that no Japanese fighter could match. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most respected aces and among the few to survive the war, captured that feeling in his post-war writings. The Mustang was a magnificent machine. Fast, powerful, perfectly armed. When it appeared over Tokyo, I knew the war was lost, he remembered, looking up at formations of P-51s and realizing that Japan's faith in spirit and sacrifice could not bridge the growing gulf of technology and production. We were defending our homeland, Sakai recalled, with worn-out planes, inexperienced pilots, and fuel so poor it fouled our engines. The enemy flew for 1,500 miles to reach us, fought, and returned safely. We could barely fly 200 before turning back. Was a bitter acknowledgement that the very concept of Japanese invincibility had evaporated in the contrails above Tokyo. WW2 P-51 Mustang was more than a fighter plane. It was the physical embodiment of American industrial might, a symbol of what happens when science, engineering, and strategy align. Every Mustang that soared over Japan carried the weight of an entire nation's industry. Each one represented the effort of American factories producing over 96,000 aircraft in 1944, including 12,000 Mustangs, while Japan's struggling war economy managed fewer than 28,000 planes of all types. Many built in tunnels, caves, or dispersed facilities to avoid bombing. By 1945, Japanese aircraft production was collapsing. Raw materials were scarce. Aluminum was replaced with wood and recycled metal. Quality control disintegrated. Rivets were misaligned. Parts didn't fit. Engines overheated. Entire batches of aircraft rolled off assembly lines already unfit for flight. The Mustang, by contrast, was the pinnacle of consistency. Its Packard-built Merlin engine was a masterpiece of precision, capable of maintaining peak performance at high altitudes for hours. American pilots flew long before dawn, crossed 1,000 miles of ocean, fought over the enemy's homeland, and came back the same day. The Japanese could no longer imagine that kind of reach. Behind that superiority was more than technology. It was training. By 1945, the American pilot training system was the most advanced the world had ever seen. From primary instruction to combat readiness, pilots logged hundreds of flight hours, trained in multiple aircraft types, and practiced gunnery, tactics, and instrument navigation under experienced combat veterans. Japan's training system, on the other hand, had collapsed. Fuel shortages meant flight hours were cut drastically. Ammunition for target practice was almost non-existent. Experienced instructors had been killed earlier in the war, replaced by hastily trained officers with little real combat knowledge. The result was catastrophic. New Japanese pilots were sent to the front after barely learning to fly. Many died on their first mission, and even when they did reach the skies, their aircraft couldn't compete. By mid-1945, Japan's once revolutionary Mitsubishi A6M0 was obsolete. A 1940 design facing a 1944 machine. The Zero still turned beautifully, but its speed, firepower, and protection were hopelessly outmatched. The Mustang could outclimb, outgun, and outrun it with ease. The difference in engine power alone, 1,695 horsepower to the Zero's 940, made dogfighting nearly suicidal for Japanese pilots. The psychological toll was immense. Pilots who survived often returned to find their airfields destroyed, their families gone, and their homeland burning. By July, the war's final outcome was clear even before the bombs fell. The Japanese high command knew they could no longer defend their skies, their cities, or their sea routes. The Mustangs had made sure of it. When B-29s carrying the atomic bombs took off for Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they did so under complete American air supremacy. No Japanese fighters rose to challenge them. None could. The destruction that followed was unprecedented, but it was also the final confirmation that Japan's war machine had already been dismantled long before the atomic age dawned. In the aftermath, American surveys confirmed what the pilots already knew. Japan's defeat in the air had been absolute. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that by summer 1945, Japan no longer possessed a functioning air defense system. Its production lines were shattered, its resources exhausted, and its remaining aircraft largely grounded. The Mustangs had done more than win battles. They had erased Japan's ability to resist. Yet even in victory, the Mustang pilots felt the weight of what they had seen. They had watched cities vanish beneath firestorms, seen enemy pilots bail out only to crash into the sea, and flown through storms that devoured entire squadrons. They had carried the war to its bitter end, and when it was over, they had to find their way home. For the pilots who flew from Iwo Jima, those months became a lifetime. They had faced an ocean larger than fear, fought a desperate enemy, and survived missions that seemed impossible. When peace finally came, many Mustangs stayed behind, their engines cooling under the same skies they had once dominated. Others were shipped home, refurbished, and used in new wars like Korea. But some, the lucky few, survived long enough to become legends. Today, when a P-51 roars across the sky at an air show, it's more than nostalgia. It's a reminder of what those machines achieved, and of the people who flew them into the heart of history. The Mustang was not just an aircraft. It was a message. It said that courage, when joined with innovation and industrial power, could cross any distance, defeat any foe, and change the course of war itself. For Japan, the sight of Mustangs over Tokyo was more than a military defeat. It was the realization that the age of the samurai had ended, replaced by an era where machines, science, and scale determined survival. As the last mission logs were written and the last pilots returned home, the world entered a new chapter. One where air power ruled, and the lessons of the Mustang would shape every conflict to come. In the golden light of that first peaceful sunset over the Pacific, a single P-51 turned toward Iwo Jima, engine humming steady, wings catching the fading sun. It wasn't just going home. It was carrying with it the story of how the war in the Pacific was won. Not by chance, not by numbers alone, but by the relentless pursuit of perfection. The sound of that engine, smooth, confident, unstoppable, was the sound of history closing its chapter. The sky was quiet now. The war was over. But the legend of the Mustang had only just begun.